The world had changed in ways that were both unimaginable and irreversible. The once thriving cities had crumbled into silent ruins, the streets now abandoned, littered with remnants of a world lost to the undead. It had been 6 months since the outbreak. The virus that turned ordinary people into savage monsters had spread faster than anyone could have prepared for. Governments fell, civilizations crumbled, and humanity was left struggling for survival. Yet, amidst this chaos, there was one group of survivors who had managed to endure. Jenna had been just another face in the crowd before the outbreak. She was an office worker, living a life of routine: wake up, go to work, return home, repeat. But all of that changed the day the infection began. She still remembered the sounds, the screams, the crashes, and the gunfire echoing through her apartment building as the first wave of the infected arrived. There was no warning. No time to react. Just pure, unadulterated panic. Jenna had managed to escape the city, fleeing to the countryside with a small group of survivors. They had found refuge in an old, abandoned farmhouse. Life was different now. Every day was a struggle for food, water, and safety. And every night, they huddled together, knowing that the world they once knew was gone forever. The farmhouse had become their haven, but it was also a constant reminder of how fragile life had become. The land was overrun with danger. Zombies roamed freely, their bloodshot eyes searching for any sign of life. Nature had reclaimed what was once man-made, and the small group of survivors had learned to adapt. They fortified the farmhouse, turning it into a small fortress, but even that couldn't protect them forever. As dawn broke one morning, Jenna stood by the farmhouse window, gazing out over the desolate landscape. The sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon. It was a beautiful sight, one she hadn't truly appreciated since the fall of the old world. But now, in the midst of the apocalypse, the sunrise felt like a symbol of something more, a symbol of hope. It was the first time in months that Jenna had allowed herself to feel anything other than fear or sadness. "Jenna, are you all right?" A voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Sarah, a close friend who had been with her since the early days of the outbreak. Sarah had always been the practical one, the one who kept the group together when it felt like everything was falling apart. She had a calm, steady demeanor that helped keep Jenna grounded. Jenna nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression softening. "You've been doing a lot of that lately. What's on your mind?" Jenna hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should voice the thoughts that had been troubling her. But something inside her urged her to speak. I think there's more out there than just zombies. I mean, the world is dead, but we're still alive. We have to keep fighting. There has to be something left, right?" Sarah studied her for a long moment, as though weighing the depth of Jenna's words. Finally, she spoke. "I know what you mean. We can't just survive day by day. We have to find a reason to keep going. A purpose." Jenna turned back to the window, watching the horizon as the last of the night's darkness melted away. The world was still out there, somewhere. It wasn't over. Not yet. A loud crash suddenly echoed from outside. The sound of something heavy being knocked over, followed by the unmistakable growl of the undead. Jenna's heart raced. The peace of the morning shattered in an instant. She glanced over at Sarah, who had already grabbed her rifle and was moving toward the door. "Stay here," Sarah instructed, her voice low but firm. Jenna shook her head. "I'm not staying behind." Without another word, they both rushed out the door. The farmhouse was surrounded by a large, overgrown garden, and it only took a moment for Jenna to spot the first group of zombies staggering toward the house. Their eyes were vacant, their movements erratic as they followed the sound of the noise they had heard. Jenna's pulse quickened as she grabbed her own weapon, a battered, old shotgun that had seen better days. Sarah was already taking aim, firing a shot that echoed through the air. The first zombie fell, but more were coming, drawn to the sound of the gunshot. "We need to move," Sarah shouted, pulling Jenna toward the barn. They had to act quickly. The undead were relentless, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. As they reached the barn, Jenna glanced back at the farmhouse. The group was inside, trying to secure the doors, but they couldn't stay there forever. "What now?" Jenna asked, her breath heavy from the adrenaline. Sarah paused for a moment, surveying their surroundings. "We leave the farm. There's a small town about 20 miles east. If we're lucky, we might find something, food, supplies, maybe even other survivors." It was a risk. But it was their only chance. The group had to leave the safety of the farmhouse if they were going to survive. Jenna's heart beat faster as she looked toward the horizon. There was hope, she realized, in the unknown. A new dawn was breaking, not just in the sky, but in their hearts. It was time to take the first step toward finding it. 2 of 2. The decision had been made quickly, but with little debate. Survival was the priority, and staying at the farmhouse with the undead closing in was no longer an option. The group, Jenna, Sarah, and 3 others, had gathered what little they could in a few hastily packed bags, canned food, water, ammunition, and anything else they thought might be useful on their journey. The farmhouse had been home, a place of fleeting safety, but it was time to move on. The barn door creaked loudly as Sarah pushed it open, leading the way with her rifle in hand. The others followed, their faces marked by uncertainty and fear, but there was also a glimmer of hope in their eyes. The road ahead was unknown, but it was better than staying in one place, waiting for death to find them. As they made their way toward the dirt road that led to the small town 20 miles away, the group stayed in a tight formation, eyes constantly scanning for any signs of movement. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows on the ground. The world was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. "How far is it, exactly?" one of the survivors, Mark, asked. He was in his early 30s, a former mechanic who had quickly become an invaluable part of the group. He was strong, resourceful, and never hesitated when it came to getting things done. "About 20 miles, Sarah said, her voice steady but taut with the tension of the unknown. "We should be able to make it by the end of the day if we keep a steady pace." Jenna nodded, but the unease gnawing at her didn't dissipate. The thought of being out in the open, exposed, felt like walking into a trap. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound of movement, sent her heart racing. The world outside the farmhouse was a vast, unforgiving place, and every step forward seemed like a risk. But it was one they had to take. The first hour of the journey was relatively uneventful. They passed through fields of tall grass, the wind rustling through the blades as they trudged forward. The landscape was surprisingly peaceful, almost serene. But there was an unsettling undercurrent to it, an awareness that danger could be lurking around any corner. Jenna's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. "Do you think there are other survivors out there?" she asked Sarah as they walked side by side. The question had been on her mind for a while, but she hadn't had the courage to voice it until now. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her grip on her rifle, her gaze distant. "I hope so. But we can't count on it. We've seen what happens when people get desperate. It doesn't always end well." Jenna's heart sank at the answer. The world had changed so drastically in such a short time, and the people they once knew seemed like a distant memory. But Sarah was right. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. As they continued walking, the silence between the 2 women grew heavier. Jenna's thoughts wandered to the days before the outbreak, to the mundane tasks and routines that seemed so insignificant now. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had gone to work at her office job, a lifetime ago that she had worried about deadlines and meetings. Now, the only thing that mattered was survival. The sound of footsteps crunching on the dirt road brought Jenna's attention back to the present. Mark, who had been walking ahead, stopped abruptly. His hand shot up in a signal for the group to halt. Everyone froze, eyes darting around in alarm. "What is it?" Jenna whispered, her pulse quickening. Mark gestured toward the tree line on the right side of the road. "Something's moving over there," he muttered, his voice low. Jenna squinted, trying to make out any shape or movement. The wind was picking up, making it hard to hear anything beyond the rustling of the leaves. But then, there it was, a faint, shuffling sound. A low growl echoed through the trees. "They're coming," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to move, now." Without a second thought, the group turned and began to sprint down the road, their hearts pounding in their chests. The growls grew louder, and Jenna could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, but relentless, closing in on them. "We're not going to outrun them," Mark shouted, looking over his shoulder in panic. "We need to find somewhere to hide." Jenna's mind raced. There were no buildings in sight, no cover, just endless open space. She glanced toward Sarah, who was already making decisions, her face set with determination. "Head for the woods," Sarah commanded. "We need to take cover and figure out a plan." The group veered off the road and into the woods, the dense trees providing some shelter from the open field. Jenna's breath was coming in ragged gasps as they pushed forward, adrenaline surging through her veins. The sounds of the undead grew louder, and she could hear the unmistakable shuffle of their feet on the dirt. They were close. The forest was thick with undergrowth, but Jenna barely noticed the branches scratching her arms or the uneven ground beneath her feet. All that mattered was staying ahead of the monsters chasing them. They couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. They reached a small clearing just as the first of the zombies emerged from the treeline. Sarah whirled around, her rifle coming up in a smooth motion. A shot rang out, and one of the undead dropped to the ground with a thud. But more were coming, too many to fight off all at once. "Keep moving," Sarah shouted. "We can't fight them all." Jenna turned to run, her mind racing. She didn't know where they were going, didn't know what awaited them on the other side of the woods. But as the sounds of the undead grew nearer, she realized that the only choice was to keep moving forward. There was no going back now. They were on a new path, and they had to trust that somewhere, out there, hope still existed. The forest stretched out before them like an endless maze of trees and shadows. The group had managed to distance themselves from the undead, but the danger wasn't over. Jenna could hear the faint growls behind them, the unmistakable shuffle of their pursuers closing the gap. They couldn't stop, not yet, not until they were safe. The dense woods offered some cover, but it also disoriented them. With each step, the group grew more exhausted, their breathing ragged and labored. Jenna's legs ached, and her heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of their escape. They had been running for what felt like hours, and yet the forest showed no signs of thinning out. "How much farther?" Mark asked, his voice strained as he glanced over at Sarah. "We need to get to the other side of this forest," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the trees ahead. "If we can make it to the open fields, we'll have more room to maneuver." The group nodded, pushing forward despite their fatigue. But the deeper they went into the forest, the heavier the air seemed to become. The once peaceful environment now felt like a trap, each rustling leaf and snapping twig a reminder of the danger that lurked just out of sight. Jenna's thoughts flickered back to the farmhouse. It had been their sanctuary, a place of comfort, a place where they had let their guard down, even if just for a moment. It felt like a lifetime ago. "Jenna, you okay?" Sarah's voice cut through the fog of her thoughts. She turned to see her friend looking at her, concern etched on her face. Jenna nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just thinking." Sarah didn't press her, but the look she gave Jenna was one of quiet understanding. Jenna had always been the one to think things through, to analyze every situation before acting. But this world didn't allow for that kind of luxury. Survival was about instinct, about reacting quickly and without hesitation. The slow, methodical approach that had worked in the old world no longer had a place in the new one. They continued walking, the trees around them thickening as they pressed on. There was no path, no road to follow, only the sounds of the forest and the occasional distant groan of the undead. Jenna's mind kept drifting back to the day the world changed. She had been at work when the first reports started coming in. The news anchors had been frantic, their voices shaking as they described the first cases of what was called a viral outbreak. The reports were sketchy at best, filled with confusion and uncertainty. No one knew how the virus spread, or what it even was. But within hours, cities were in chaos, and within days, the world was plunged into darkness. Jenna had tried to reach her family, but the lines were down. She remembered the panic setting in as she realized she might never see them again. She had tried to reach her mother's house, but the streets were swarming with people running, screaming, trying to escape the inevitable. It was then she realized that no one was truly safe. Not anymore. "We're close," Sarah's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I can see the edge of the forest. Just a little farther." Jenna's heart lifted, but it was short-lived. They still had to get through the woods, and the undead weren't the only threat they had to worry about. The human element in this new world was just as dangerous, perhaps more so. Desperation led to betrayal, and trust had become a luxury no one could afford. Jenna had seen it happen too many times already: groups that fractured under pressure, people turning on each other when food and water became scarce. She couldn't help but wonder if the group she was with now would survive long enough to reach safety, or if they, too, would become another casualty of the apocalypse. The sound of a twig snapping ahead brought them to an immediate halt. Sarah signaled for the group to crouch down, her rifle aimed at the trees in front of them. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. Had the undead found them again? But then, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, its movements slow and deliberate. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face gaunt and covered in dirt. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, his eyes hollow and weary. Jenna tensed, her hand instinctively gripping her shotgun. She wasn't sure if this man was a survivor or just another dangerous stranger. The world was full of both. "Stay back," Sarah ordered quietly, her voice firm. "We don't know if he's one of them." The man stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the group. When his gaze landed on Sarah, he seemed to relax, just slightly, but his hands remained raised, palms open in a gesture of peace. "I'm not infected," the man rasped, his voice rough and hoarse. "I swear. I'm just trying to survive, like you." Sarah didn't lower her rifle. "Where did you come from?" The man swallowed, looking nervously between the group. "I was part of a small group, back at a farm about 10 miles from here. We were doing all right, until we were overrun by the infected. I was the only one who made it out." There was a long pause, the group weighing his words. The man's story could be true, but in this world, truth and lies were hard to distinguish. "Why are you out here alone?" Mark asked, his voice skeptical. "Ran out of food. Supplies were gone. I couldn't stay there anymore," the man said, his eyes dropping to the ground in shame. Jenna felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to lose everything. But could they trust him? Could they afford to? Before anyone could respond, another growl echoed through the trees, low and guttural. More zombies were coming. "We don't have time for this," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. "You can either help us fight or run. Your choice." The man hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll help. Just, don't leave me out here." With that, the group moved quickly into the trees, the sounds of the undead growing closer. They had no choice now but to fight. It was a risk, but in this new world, they had to take chances if they were going to survive. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Jenna's thoughts once again turned to the past. The world they knew was gone, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to rebuild it. They just had to survive long enough to find out. The forest had grown darker as they continued, the shadows creeping in with every step they took. The sounds of the undead were all around them now, closer, more insistent, their guttural growls and dragging footsteps reverberating through the trees. Time was running out. They couldn't afford to stand still for long. Jenna stole a glance at the man who had joined their group, his gaunt form trailing behind them. His name, they had learned, was Derek. He had been on his own for days after his small group of survivors had been wiped out. Jenna felt the weight of his desperation, the way he clung to them, trying to prove his worth, trying to show that he could be useful. But the others were wary, especially Sarah. Jenna couldn't blame her. In this world, trust had become a rare commodity. Every person could be a threat, every new face another potential danger. They didn't know if Derek had been a part of the group that had fallen to the infected or if he was hiding something darker. But for now, they needed him, or at least, that's what Sarah had decided. They couldn't afford to be picky. The undead were closing in, and they needed all the help they could get. "We need to find a place to hold up for the night," Sarah said in a low voice as she scanned their surroundings. "We can't keep pushing forward without some rest." Jenna agreed. The sun was beginning to set, and exhaustion was taking its toll on everyone. Their progress through the woods had slowed to a crawl as the darkness deepened. The forest was closing in on them, the trees blocking what little light remained. There had to be somewhere to hide until the danger passed. "We'll find shelter," Mark said, his eyes darting nervously around. "I'm sure there's something nearby." They walked in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional snap of a branch. Jenna could hear her own breathing, ragged and uneven. Every step felt like a small victory, a chance to put more distance between themselves and the undead. It was then that Derek suddenly stopped. His eyes were wide, his head tilted as if listening for something. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The group paused, straining to listen. At first, Jenna didn't hear anything, but then it came, the unmistakable sound of something scratching, scraping against wood. It was faint, but it was there. Sarah held up her hand to signal the group to stop. "Where's it coming from?" she asked, her eyes scanning the trees. Derek pointed ahead, toward a thick cluster of trees. "Over there. Behind those trees." The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The scratching grew louder as they approached, a strange, almost rhythmic noise, like claws raking across bark. It sent a chill down Jenna's spine. They reached the trees, and Sarah, without hesitation, parted the branches to reveal a small, makeshift shelter, a pile of branches and debris hastily piled together. Jenna's eyes widened. It looked like someone had been living there. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Inside, they found remnants of a campfire and a few scattered belongings, a half-eaten can of beans, an old jacket, and a small, rusted knife. It was the kind of shelter someone might have built in a hurry, with no real plan for survival. "This could work," Sarah said, her voice low. "We'll set up camp here for the night." The group settled in, the tension between them palpable. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about Derek's story. He had seemed too eager to join them, too quick to volunteer. But what choice did they have? They needed food and rest, and this shelter was the best they could hope for. As night fell, the group sat around the remnants of the fire, the glow of the flames casting long shadows on the ground. The undead were still out there, somewhere in the dark, but for now, they were safe, at least, as safe as one could be in a world like this. Derek sat slightly apart from the others, his eyes flicking nervously between them. Jenna noticed that he hadn't said much since they'd made camp, and his silence only added to the unease that hung in the air. He was looking for something, perhaps a way to prove himself, or maybe a way to manipulate the situation. Mark leaned over to Sarah. "Do you trust him?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Sarah didn't immediately answer. She was watching Derek, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I don't trust anyone anymore." Jenna felt a shiver of unease. They had all learned the hard way that trust was a dangerous thing in this new world. But even still, she couldn't help but wonder if they were being too cautious. Could Derek really be dangerous? Or was he just another person trying to survive, like the rest of them? The wind began to pick up, the trees swaying above them, and the sound of the undead grew fainter, like an ominous murmur in the distance. But something else was happening, something that made Jenna's skin crawl. A shadow moved at the edge of the camp, flickering in the corner of her vision. She turned quickly, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Mark stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "Did anyone see that?" he asked, his voice tense. "I did," Sarah replied, her rifle already in hand. Stay alert. The group fell silent, each person straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. The shadows seemed to grow darker, the air colder. Jenna's pulse quickened. They weren't alone. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the forest, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. The undead had found them again. But this time, it wasn't just one or two. The sound of movement was growing, louder, closer. Jenna's heart raced. They didn't have much time. "We need to move," Sarah said urgently. "Get ready." The group scrambled to their feet, adrenaline kicking in. They had no time to pack up their belongings or prepare for the inevitable. They had to run, fast. But as Jenna turned to grab her shotgun, she caught sight of Derek. He was standing motionless, his eyes fixed on the dark edge of the forest. His hands were trembling, and there was something in his gaze that made her blood run cold. And then she realized, he wasn't looking at the undead. He was looking at them. It was too late to backtrack now. Whatever Derek's true intentions were, they were about to find out. And they were about to find out the hard way. The growl of the undead grew louder, a wave of terrifying sound crashing through the woods. They were closing in. Every instinct in Jenna's body screamed to run, to escape the impending onslaught. But Derek's behavior, his eerie stillness in the face of danger, had her on edge. He wasn't looking at the undead, his gaze was fixed on them. His eyes, wide and frantic, flickered with something darker, something more unsettling. "Get moving!" Sarah shouted, breaking the tension, her voice sharp and commanding. The group snapped into action. But as they scrambled to gather their things and head into the trees, Jenna noticed Derek wasn't moving. He stood frozen, a strange look of indecision crossing his features. "Derek!" Mark yelled, but there was no response. The man was too far gone in his own thoughts, or maybe he was planning something. Jenna couldn't be sure. Then, it happened, something snapped within Derek. He suddenly lunged forward, heading toward the thick of the forest where the sounds of the undead were now unmistakably close. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. Was he running toward them? "Wait," she cried out, but it was too late. Derek was already dashing into the darkness, leaving the group behind. His footsteps echoed through the trees, growing distant with each passing second. "He's gone crazy," Mark hissed, his voice barely containing the anger that bubbled to the surface. Before anyone could react, the first of the undead appeared, a twisted, decaying form stumbling out of the woods, its eyes hollow and lifeless. Its mouth dripped with foul remnants of what had once been human flesh. And then came another, and another, until the air was thick with their growls and rasping breaths. "Damn it," Sarah muttered, her eyes flicking between the group and the oncoming wave of zombies. "We need to move, now." Jenna's heart pounded as she grabbed her shotgun, her hands shaking. They couldn't stay here. Not with the undead bearing down on them and Derek nowhere to be found. "We can't waste time looking for him," Sarah said, her face set in grim determination. "We need to survive." Reluctantly, the group turned, abandoning the search for Derek. Their goal was survival, and right now, they had to make it out of the forest. The undead were closer than ever. The group made their way through the dense woods, weaving through trees and underbrush, trying to avoid the zombies that were now moving swiftly toward them. The sound of their feet shuffling through the leaves grew louder, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The forest, once an ally in hiding them from the infected, now felt like a prison. The trees seemed to close in around them, narrowing their path with each step. Jenna could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. It was only a matter of time before they were surrounded, and the thought made her pulse race. "Over there!" Mark pointed, his voice urgent. Through the trees, Jenna could make out what appeared to be a break in the woods, an open clearing, a patch of land that might give them the room they needed to escape the imminent danger. "Keep moving!" Sarah barked. "It's our only shot." They ran faster, the sounds of the undead drawing nearer with every second. Jenna's mind raced. She wanted to keep going, to keep moving toward that clearing, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Derek. He had abandoned them, and now, more than ever, it was clear, they couldn't trust anyone. The suspicion that had crept into her heart ever since Derek had joined them was now confirmed. His actions had spoken louder than any words. The clearing was just ahead, but as they neared it, the group slowed. Something was wrong. The ground ahead of them wasn't as clear as it had appeared. A thud echoed through the air, followed by another. Jenna's heart sank as she realized what had happened. Derek had triggered a trap, one set by the undead. The clearing was full of them, more zombies, stumbling and moaning as they closed in on the survivors. But this time, they were not just wandering aimlessly. They had been drawn to the noise. And it was Derek who had led them straight into their midst. "Damn it," Sarah muttered under her breath. "We're surrounded." The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the group was stuck, the clearing offering no refuge. Zombies circled them, pressing in from all sides, their gnarled hands reaching out, their eyes fixed on their prey. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as the closest zombie lunged at them. Without thinking, she raised her shotgun and fired. The blast rang out through the forest, and the undead creature fell to the ground with a sickening thud. But that was just the beginning. More were coming. "Move!" Sarah ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Back into the woods." They fought their way back into the cover of the trees, but the undead weren't the only danger now. The air was charged with a feeling of betrayal, of distrust that ran deeper than the forest itself. "Derek led us into that trap," Mark said through gritted teeth, his eyes flashing with fury. "He did this. I knew we couldn't trust him." But there was no time to argue. There were too many zombies closing in, and too few of them left to fight them off. The group pushed forward, determined to put as much distance between themselves and the horde as possible. In the distance, Jenna thought she saw Derek. His silhouette was barely visible, but it was there. Was he trying to help, or had he simply abandoned them? With one last desperate push, they reached a small stream that cut through the forest, its cold water offering a brief reprieve. They stopped to catch their breath, the sound of the zombies slowly fading as the distance between them grew. But even as the immediate threat subsided, Jenna knew this wasn't over. Derek was still out there, and they would have to deal with the consequences of his betrayal sooner or later. For now, though, the group was safe, for a moment. And that was all they could ask for in this new, unforgiving world. But trust, once broken, was a hard thing to rebuild. And as the moon rose high above the trees, Jenna wondered just how long they could continue surviving in a world where nothing, and no one, was certain. The cool water of the stream trickled over Jenna's feet as she sat on the rocky bank, trying to steady her breathing. The events of the last few hours had left her exhausted, both physically and mentally. Derek's betrayal still weighed heavily on her, a gnawing presence in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something far worse. "Sarah," Mark said, his voice low and tense, "we need to make a plan. The more we delay, the more dangerous this gets." Sarah's face was set in grim determination as she glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning the surrounding trees. She was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I know," she said, her voice calm but strained. "But we can't just run blindly anymore. We need to find shelter, somewhere secure. If Derek's out there, it's only a matter of time before he leads the infected to us again." Jenna's gaze shifted to the forest ahead. The idea of staying in one place for too long felt like a death sentence now. Every minute they spent stationary brought them closer to being discovered by the undead. But the forest around them was dense, the terrain difficult. Moving was going to be just as risky. "Do you think Derek is still out there?" Jenna asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm not sure," Sarah replied, her jaw tightening. "But we have to assume he's either dead or coming for us. Either way, we can't rely on anyone but ourselves right now." The truth of Sarah's words settled into the pit of Jenna's stomach. In a world where every day was a struggle to survive, trust was a fragile thing. And now, it seemed, trust was something they couldn't afford. "I don't understand why he would do it," Mark said, his brow furrowing. "We were supposed to be a team. We were supposed to stick together." He was a liability, Sarah muttered, running a hand through her hair. People who act without thinking are dangerous. And now we're paying for it. Jenna wanted to say something, to argue that maybe Derek had acted out of fear, that maybe there was a reason he had led them into the trap, but she couldn't. She wasn't sure if she even believed it herself anymore. The man they had taken in, the one who had seemed desperate for connection, had turned out to be their undoing. Where do we go now? Jenna asked, trying to refocus on the immediate task at hand. North, Sarah answered after a pause. There's a settlement up that way. I've heard rumors of people surviving there, people who have managed to hold out. If we can make it, it'll be the safest place for us. Mark looked uneasy. You sure about this? What if it's just another trap? Sarah's eyes narrowed. If we don't try, we'll never know. And I'm not ready to give up. Jenna nodded, though doubt lingered in her mind. The idea of reaching a safe place was the only thing that kept her moving forward. But was it really safe? The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. She could no longer take anything for granted, not the rumors, not the stories of survivors, not even the people she was with. Let's move, Sarah said, pushing herself to her feet. We don't have time to waste. The group set off again, heading north through the dense underbrush. The forest seemed even more oppressive now, the trees closing in on them like silent, watchful sentinels. Every crack of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of fear through Jenna's body. She couldn't shake the feeling that the undead were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hours passed slowly, and as the sun began to set, the chill of the evening air set in. Jenna's mind wandered back to Derek. Was he out there somewhere, hiding in the woods, waiting for his chance to strike? Or had he been consumed by the very thing they had been running from? It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the group, their survival. But just as Jenna was starting to settle into a rhythm, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of rustling ahead. Her pulse quickened. Mark froze, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. What is it? Jenna whispered, her eyes wide. Sarah held up her hand, signaling for them to stop. Stay quiet, she ordered, her voice barely a breath. The rustling grew louder, and then a shape appeared from behind the trees, thin, gaunt, and unmistakably human. Derek. He stepped forward slowly, his movements cautious, as though testing the air. His eyes were wild, his clothes torn and dirted. He didn't seem to notice the group at first, his gaze fixed ahead of him, distant, unfocused. But then, as though sensing their presence, he turned. Derek! Jenna called out, her voice shaking with a mix of relief and anger. What the hell are you doing here? Derek's eyes flickered to her, his expression unreadable. His mouth was dry, lips cracked and pale. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words, as if trying to remember how to speak at all. I'm sorry, he finally rasped, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean to. I had to get away. Jenna took a step back, her hand gripping her shotgun tighter. She didn't know what to feel. Anger, fear, confusion, all of it swirled together in a tangled knot inside her chest. You led us into that trap, Mark said, his voice laced with accusation. You betrayed us. You left us to die. Derek's eyes flinched at the words, but he didn't deny them. Instead, he looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I didn't have a choice, he muttered. I thought I could help, but I was wrong. I'm sorry. Jenna didn't know what to believe anymore. She had wanted to trust him, had hoped he could be a part of their group. But now, after everything that had happened, it seemed like the only thing Derek could offer was more trouble. But in the silence that followed, a realization hit her. It wasn't just Derek who had changed. It was all of them. The world had forced them to become different people, people who couldn't afford to trust anyone, even those who had once seemed like allies. They were no longer just surviving the zombie apocalypse. They were surviving each other. And the hardest part was yet to come. Stay away from us, Sarah finally said, her voice firm. We don't need any more lies. You've put us all at risk." Derek's face twisted with a mix of pain and shame, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned, retreating into the woods, leaving the group behind. As he disappeared into the darkness, Jenna felt a weight settle into her chest. There was no going back from this. And in this world, there might never be a chance to rebuild what had been lost. "Let's go," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We've got a long way to go. And I don't trust that he won't come back." Jenna nodded, forcing herself to take a step forward, away from the past. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed, not just between them and Derek, but between all of them. They weren't just running from the zombies anymore. They were running from each other. The night had fallen over the dense woods, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional distant groan of the undead. The group had been walking for hours, exhaustion pressing heavily on their shoulders. Jenna's mind was reeling, unable to escape the thought of Derek's departure. The brief interaction had only deepened the chasm between them, and now, she found herself wondering if they had made the right decision. Derek had been a part of their journey, someone they had tried to trust. But in a world like this, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. The thought kept repeating in her mind as they trudged forward, each step heavier than the last. The landscape was unfamiliar, and every shadow seemed to hold new dangers. "How much farther is it?" Mark asked, his voice strained, clearly tired from the relentless pace Sarah had set. "We're close," Sarah replied, her voice sharp, but there was no certainty in her words. She didn't want to admit it, but the growing doubt in her was palpable. The path they were on had become treacherous, every direction seemed to offer the same bleak prospects, either death by the undead or the potential betrayal of a once ally. The moon cast pale light over the path ahead, and the group pressed on, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves beneath them. Jenna kept her head low, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any movement. The forest felt too still, almost unnatural. Her senses were on high alert, but nothing stood out. No rustling, no distant cries, no growls from the infected. Her thoughts kept turning back to Derek, and as much as she tried to push them aside, they crept in, gnawing at her. Had they been too quick to turn their backs on him? He had seemed broken, lost in the same way they all were. Yet he had been the one to lead them into danger. No matter how much she tried to rationalize it, Derek had failed them, and in the world they now inhabited, failure was unforgivable. "Hey," Mark said, pulling Jenna out of her spiraling thoughts, "Sarah's been pushing us hard. Maybe we should rest for a bit." Jenna glanced over at Sarah, who hadn't slowed down or shown any sign of needing rest. Her focus was unshaken, her gaze fixed ahead as though she had no room in her mind for doubt or weakness. But there was something in her eyes, something Jenna had noticed recently, a flicker of uncertainty, something she was hiding behind her relentless exterior. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control, about proving to herself that she could handle whatever the world threw at her. That they could survive. "We can't stop," Sarah snapped, her voice laced with irritation. "We're too close. We don't stop until we find shelter." The tension between them was thickening, and Jenna could feel it. The constant strain of living in such a hostile world was wearing them all down, and Sarah's refusal to pause seemed like a test, one that Jenna wasn't sure she was prepared to take. The exhaustion was starting to show in her face, in her movements, but she wasn't ready to give in, not yet. "Sarah, we can't push ourselves this hard," Jenna said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. "We need to sleep. We need to regain our strength." For a moment, Sarah didn't respond. Her jaw clenched, and Jenna could almost see the internal battle playing out within her. But finally, she sighed and slowed her pace. "You're right," Sarah admitted, her voice quieter now. "Let's rest for a bit." The group settled under a cluster of trees, the canopy overhead offering some shelter from the harsh moonlight. They didn't have much in the way of supplies left, just the basics, water, some dried food, and the few weapons they had managed to hold on to. Jenna settled against a tree, her shotgun resting in her lap, while Mark leaned against a nearby boulder, his eyes half closed. Sarah, ever the strategist, kept her gaze scanning the dark edges of the forest. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day pressing heavily on their shoulders. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, there was an emotional toll that couldn't be shaken. In a world where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, the burden of those decisions was something they couldn't escape. Jenna broke the silence, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Do you think we'll make it to that settlement?" Mark's gaze met hers, his eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. "I hope so. I don't know what else we can do." Sarah shifted, turning to face them. "We make it. We have no choice but to keep going." There was something final in her words, something unyielding. Jenna knew Sarah wasn't just talking about the settlement. She was talking about them, about the group. They had no choice but to survive, no matter the cost. "How much further is it?" Jenna asked again, trying to push away the uncertainty that lingered. "Another few miles," Sarah answered without hesitation, but there was a crack in her voice. "It won't be easy, but we'll get there. We just need to keep our heads down and stay quiet. The last thing we want is to attract attention." It was then that Jenna realized that it wasn't just the undead they were running from, it was the world itself. The isolation, the constant fear of betrayal, the uncertainty that hung in the air like a dark cloud. It was all-consuming, and every decision seemed like it could be their last. But that was the world now, a world where trust had no place, and survival was the only currency. "We've lost a lot," Mark said quietly, breaking her thoughts. "I just don't know if we can take much more." Jenna nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Derek's betrayal had left a scar, one that might never heal. But they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The past was a weight they couldn't afford to carry. As they prepared to continue their journey, Jenna couldn't help but wonder, if they reached the settlement, would they find peace? Or would it be yet another false hope, another illusion of safety in a world that had long since lost its innocence? For now, they only had one option: keep moving, keep surviving. The world outside wasn't going to wait for them to figure it out. And whatever happened, they had to face it together. Even if that meant facing the unknown, the uncertainty, and the ever-looming threat of the undead. They stood up, their packs heavy with the weight of survival. Jenna glanced once more into the dark woods, her thoughts a swirl of doubt and fear. But when Sarah motioned for them to move forward, Jenna followed, knowing that each step was one closer to something, whatever it was, that lay beyond the horizon. One way or another, they would find out. And they would survive. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. It was a sight that had become rare, almost precious. The world had been so dark for so long that Jenna had forgotten what it felt like to wake up to hope. The tension in her chest loosened slightly as she took in the calm beauty of the morning. For the first time in a long while, the world felt almost normal. But then, as quickly as the thought came, it was gone. The undead hadn't disappeared with the night, nor had the betrayal and loss that haunted them. They were still there, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. The group had made it through the night, but barely. After hours of trudging through the forest, they'd finally found a secluded spot, an abandoned shack at the edge of a clearing. It wasn't much, but it had offered shelter from the cold, and for that, they were grateful. As Sarah stood watch, her eyes fixed on the woods, the others tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every shift in the air had them on edge. Now, as the sun began to rise, the weight of the last few days settled heavily on them. Jenna rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her muscles, but she didn't allow herself to show weakness. Not now. She turned to look at Mark, who was packing up the few supplies they had left. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with dark circles. The journey had taken its toll on him, too, and yet, he still had a glimmer of determination in his gaze. It was a reminder that, despite everything, they were still moving forward. He caught her looking at him and gave a small, weary smile. It didn't last long. "Ready to go?" he asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Jenna nodded, her stomach tightening. She glanced at Sarah, who was already adjusting her gear, the weight of their next move clearly on her mind. "Yeah," Sarah said, meeting Jenna's gaze. We keep moving. No turning back now. The group fell into line, moving silently through the forest. The sounds of the world waking up around them, the chirping birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, felt almost surreal. It was like stepping into another life, one that had existed before the outbreak. But Jenna knew that life was long gone. Now, it was a world ruled by the dead, by fear, by survival. And they were living ghosts in it. The road ahead was uncertain, and no matter how much they hoped, Jenna couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. Every step they took felt heavier. They were pushing themselves further than they ever had before, testing their limits, and Jenna wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Hours passed as they made their way through the dense woods, but the settlement Sarah had mentioned remained elusive. The promise of safety was distant, and the fear that it, too, was a mirage began to creep in. But then, as they rounded a bend in the path, something shifted. Jenna's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward, a sharp breath escaping her as she took in the sight before her. A cluster of buildings. They weren't much, but they were real. The settlement. It was small, isolated, but there were signs of life, fresh tracks on the ground, smoke rising from chimneys, and the faint sound of movement coming from behind the structures. This was it. They had made it. Is that it? Mark whispered, almost disbelieving. His voice broke the heavy silence. Sarah nodded slowly, her face unreadable. It looks like it. But we don't know what we're walking into. Be prepared for anything. As they approached cautiously, Jenna's heart raced. Was this the refuge they'd been hoping for? Or was it another empty dream, a place that had once been filled with hope but was now as forsaken as everything else? Every step felt like a test. The door to one of the buildings creaked open, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the light. A tall man, his clothes tattered but his posture strong, regarded them with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. His face was hardened, weathered by years of survival, but there was no malice in his expression. "You lost?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. Sarah didn't hesitate. "We're looking for shelter. We've been traveling for days." The man's eyes flicked to the group, taking in their appearance, the dirt-smeared faces, the weariness in their eyes. He seemed to consider them for a moment before nodding slowly. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. "But keep your guard up. We don't trust easily. No one does anymore." Jenna hesitated, the tension in her body still high. Trust. It had been a long time since she had trusted anyone, and even now, the idea of relying on others felt like a gamble. But they had no choice. They entered the settlement, a small, self-sufficient community of survivors who had managed to carve out a semblance of life in the chaos. There were gardens, makeshift barricades, and people going about their daily routines. The air was thick with caution, but there was also something else, hope. It wasn't much, but it was real. As the door closed behind them, Jenna felt the weight of their journey lift, even if just for a moment. They weren't safe yet, not completely, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that survival was possible. They had found a new dawn. And for that, they could be thankful. But even in this fragile sanctuary, Jenna knew one thing for sure. The world had changed. And with that change, they would have to keep fighting, not just for their survival, but for the hope that had once been lost. There was no going back. Only forward. And maybe, just maybe, they could build something new here. Something worth fighting for. A new dawn had come. But the battle wasn't over yet.